Greetings, everyone. My name is Rebecca Geschwind, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, What's Your Data Plan? Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to Campbell & Company webinars. To ensure your great webinar experience, close all other programs other than GoToWebinar that is running on your computer. Call in using a telephone instead of your computer speakers. Mute your phone, and if you experience any visual issues, you can send us a chat. You may also contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. Finally, today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you will earn 1 continuing education credit for your participation, good for certification with CFRE International. About an hour after the webinar, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes a web address to download your certificate, the PDF of the presentation, and it will include a link to the recording. And now I would like to hand it over to Carrie Dahlquist. Carrie?
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you all for joining us today. We're very happy to have you with us, and I'm excited to be here talking about data, which is one of my favorite things in the world. So we are going to very quickly cover our agenda. I know we've got a lot of material to get through over the course of this next hour, and I think, Rebecca, we want to encourage people to send in questions as they have them. I may be able to stop in the middle if it seems like there's something that's really pertinent to the conversation, and otherwise we'll try to cover as many at the end as possible. So very quickly, our focus today is all about data and information that's out there. I want to start by spending just a few moments talking about philanthropic trends and why we are using data differently now than we have in the past and why that's important. We're going to do kind of a deep dive into the kind of information that is out there and what's available to us and helping to drive our fundraising programs. We want to talk about how to use that data effectively and efficiently. And at the end, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how to build and implement a data plan. So as I mentioned, I want to start with talking about trends. I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about trends in our sector, but I think it's really helpful to help frame a conversation. So according to Giving USA, in 2015, philanthropic contributions totaled about $373 billion. That number is generally on the rise and is looking good across most of the sectors of our industry. So really, really exciting about the level of contributions. Also, over 80% of that is given or directed by individuals. And meanwhile, nonprofits across all of our sectors are seeing select income streams decrease. So whether that's due to dips in their earned income or government contracts or reimbursements that have been pulled, there are other really viable, historically viable income streams that are decreasing. And so whatever the reason, organizations are becoming increasingly more and more dependent on their philanthropic donations to fund those operations. Historically, programs were expected to grow about 3 or 5% or some percent a year to meet their budget needs. Oftentimes it was at the discretion of the finance or the budget office to tell us all what our annual increases would be. But more and more we're seeing finance or the budget office work hand in hand with our fundraising operations, with our advancement and development programs to produce realistic projections, which are increasingly being informed by the prospect pipeline. I think that's really, really exciting, and I think it underscores the important work that we are all collectively doing together. This means that fundraising programs have more credibility and opportunity than ever to demonstrate the power of philanthropy, but it also means there's increasing pressure on being transparent, responsive, and accountable. And the good news is that data can help with all of that. So very quickly, I've got a number of different kinds of data and information up here on the screen. I know we're in the information age right now, and there's a lot of it available to us. Often our biggest problem is understanding what's out there and how it can benefit our programs. So I'm going to very, very quickly go through the types of information that we've got listed here, and then we're going to talk about what to do with all of that. I'm going to skip over analytics for the moment because we're going to do a deeper dive into that in just a few seconds. So let's take a look at the others right now. Prospect research has always been an important function in a fundraising operation. We've been focused not only on capacity, but also where constituents currently give, who do they know, what motivates them, and how they can be better engaged. Prospect research often starts with a vendor or their online tool, and when it's done correctly, it always ends with somebody reviewing information and making informed decision about ratings. Data hygiene is a way to look at the information you currently have for your constituents and to think about how you can make it better. This is especially important for direct response programs when you're looking at something like address or phone, and increasingly it's becoming important for programs that are conducting their own predictive modeling or predictive analytics in-house. So when you consider some of the demographic appends that are out there, these can be really, really helpful if you're doing in-house modeling. Online surveys can either be used in a targeted way, for example, with board members or staff members, or they can be used as engagement tools for a wider audience. Information collected in these surveys can inform engagement strategies both at the programmatic level as well as the individual level. And we've seen a lot of focus on these recently, and we've really seen their use increase and the value associated with them increase. And benchmarking is an important tool that's really often overlooked. I think learning from your peers and aspirant peers about the different components of their programs and performance can inform both our own practices and can often help us manage expectations with our leadership or our boards. It can also help to secure additional resources. At the end of the day, most of this information can be used to inform either affinity and or capacity. And that's what's going to be really, really important to help us prioritize and manage our prospects. So now we're going to take just a brief moment and do a quick poll. I'm curious, for those of you on the phone, how well you're currently using the data that you have to drive fundraising efforts. And I think we've got some options up on the screen, and Rebecca will be able to tell us in just a moment when the results come in. But what I'd love to know is, for those of you who have joined us, how many feel like data is something that you know a little bit about, but you really haven't had time to dig into it and explore it yet? How many of you have some data but really aren't using it, and perhaps that's why you're joining us today? There are probably some who are using some data but think that you could be doing a better job with that information. Who among you are using some data but really think that you need to be looking for more? And are those of you among us who feel like you've got the right data and you know how to use it effectively? So Rebecca will let us know when we've got enough respondents to be able to share those results.
Sure.
Great. Here it comes. So, okay, interesting. So we've got 4% of you who basically have said you really haven't had time to think about this yet. 16% who have some data but really aren't using it. We've got just about half who are using some data but think you could be using it better. And then just over a quarter who are using some data but think that there might be more out there that you could be looking to. And interesting, none of you think you've got the right data and are using it well. So I think that's really helpful to think about as we move forward. As I mentioned before, I want to just do a very quick dive into analytics and why do we need it. I think this is a term that we're hearing more and more about, and increasingly I think people use it differently. So just to sort of frame our conversations, when we think about analytics, we are usually just talking about a simple way to extrapolate and analyze constituent information in a meaningful way to predict behavior and drive strategy. That's probably not any more clear than the picture that you're looking at on the screen, but I think the idea is that you've got a lot of information either in your system or at your fingertips, and depending on the way that you analyze that information and roll it up can really help inform your strategies, the way that you approach people and the way that you approach programs. So I think the most important thing to start with is, out of the universe of information that's out there, how do you decide what the right analytics are for you? I think the best way is to start by acknowledging where you are now and really what the cultural appetite for information is. and realistically where you can move the needle. I think oftentimes we get someone who's excited about, the universe of information that's out there, but maybe doesn't realize sort of the baby steps that are going to be needed in the organization where they are to move that needle. So just acknowledging where you are, I think, is a really, really important first step, because ultimately we want to make sure that you're able to use the information that you end up with. So once you identify that, you want to think about what you want. So for example, if you want more information about how engaged your prospects are, you need to determine whether or not you have the internal resources to produce that in-house. So that's when we're talking about internal resources, we're talking about both people and systems. Sometimes we can do these things in-house, and sometimes we need to contract with a vendor or a consultant. And if it's the latter, you're going to need to consider your budget. It's important to recognize that there is a spectrum here. On one end, there are very simple solutions that you can likely implement with your current staff and system. And on the other end, there are much more complex or costly solutions that can give you better information. So here we're looking at a very simplified view of that spectrum. On the far left, you can see that we've got very basic information that can usually be ascertained with your current system and probably with the current skills on your staff. And then at the right, you can see that there's more complex information available that can give you perhaps better insights into your program. So when we're talking about RFM scores or engagement scores on the left, all the way to predictive modeling that can really answer almost any question that you might have in a program, I think that underscores the spectrum and determining sort of where you are and where you want to be. I think more than anything, it's important just to get started. And following today's webinar, we're actually going to be posting a handout that will walk you through how to conduct an RFM analysis, which is recency, frequency, and monetary analysis. It takes a look at how folks have been giving and how you can use their giving patterns to help predict and prioritize prospects, as well as how to develop an engagement score. These are really basic scoring mechanisms that you can do right now, if with an Excel spreadsheet and using the skills that you have among your team. And I think it gives you a good place to just get started. If you're already beyond these techniques, you can continue to think about how to use analytics to help answer questions and predict behaviors. And really, ultimately, the goal is to continue to learn what we can about capacity and affinity. And that gets us to how do we use those things together to think about the donor pyramid. So really, we want to spend a few moments talking about art versus science and how we use these at different levels among the pyramid. So at the top end of the prospect pyramid, we're really using key stakeholder knowledge, information from leaders of the institution, board members, key volunteers, and what they know about prospects. And that really can be supported by prospect research. In the middle of the pyramid, I think this is really where art meets science, and we're going to talk about this more in just a moment. Those scores and those ratings that really hone in on capacity and affinity to support relationship management, and that practice is really, really critical. And toward the bottom end of the pyramid, or the lower levels of the pyramid, you can use a lot of information to drive behavior and look for signals, trying to get people to self-identify. So we're going to go back now and talk about the top of the pyramid. As I mentioned, this is really where the art of what we do comes into play. We are focused on known prospects. There are relatively few who have the ability to make these leadership gifts, and hopefully they're already known to leaders of the institution. But what we might need more information about is what is their personal mission statement. What do we need to know about them to get them more engaged and to bring them in closer to the institution? And that's where prospect research can be really, really helpful. It can help inform information about their background and their history. It can help us to uncover information about sort of their pivotal life events and how that can tie into the mission of our organization. We can learn about where they're currently giving and what charities are high on their priority list, and other key motivations, which can help us drive engagement strategies and solicitation plans. Oh, Rebecca says we have a question.
We do. Anne would like to know, can you please repeat what RFM stands for?
Sure. RFM is recency, frequency, and monetary. It's an analysis that looks at giving patterns among your donor population and allows you to rank them, allows you to assign everyone a score, which can be really helpful in kind of prioritizing prospects. And as I mentioned, we're going to provide a lot more information about that following today's webinar. Great question, thank you. And that's the kind of thing, those scores can really be helpful when you get into the middle of the pyramid where science really does support art. So, as Anne just asked a moment ago, I think first step one is trying to find out information about capacity and affinity, whether it's, an RFM scoring, an engagement score, or more advanced predictive analytics. We want to learn about what motivates our donors, and those scores can be really, really helpful in helping us ascertain that. And the ratings coming from prospect research or from those vendor screenings can also be really, really helpful. So once we've done that, we want to get a sense of who our top prospects are, and we want to focus then on portfolio assignment and management. Once they're on our radar, it's important to look at our current portfolios and to see if there are opportunities for assignment or reassignment. And so we spend a lot of time at Campbell & Company focused on these types of analysis. And what we find is when you take a look at prospects, across an entire system or across an entire database, but ultimately, being able to uncover where the capacity is and being able to uncover those folks who look like they are engaged, who look like they could be prospects, is really, really an important first step. But then taking a look at who's currently being engaged or who's currently being managed by individual officers, what we find often is that sometimes we're spending a lot of time focusing on prospects who look like they have lower capacity or lower engagement. And so just sort of taking a step back and doing this exercise where you have looked across your system to see where are those folks that have capacity and who look engaged can be a really interesting step in the portfolio assignment and management process. And so when you're reviewing portfolios, we just want to take a moment and acknowledge that, again, here are our two aspects that we're looking at, capacity and affinity. And ideally, you want to be managing those people in the green, those people with high capacity and high affinity. There are lots of strategies that you can employ for others across the spectrum. I think when we're looking at that blue section, oftentimes we're focused on qualification because these folks may have the capacity to be major gift prospects, but perhaps they lack the connection or the interest. And then there's special opportunities to continue supporting the institution and engaging through annual giving events, volunteering, and larger cultivation opportunities for that sort of goldish section of lower capacity but high affinity. Those folks are, they care about the institution, but they may not be able to support at higher levels. So how can we keep them engaged? How can we keep them involved? How can we continue to cultivate them perhaps more as a group than individuals? And then, are there opportunities to reduce focus of institutional time and resources on that group in red, perhaps because there is a lack of interest or a lack of capacity? So how can that inform the way we think about our direct mail, for example? Do we really need to be sending mail to that group in the red, or at least do we need to send the mail every time we do a direct mail project? So I think beginning to understand these buckets and where your prospects fit into them can really help drive strategies for programs and people. So let's go back. We've talked about analytics and the importance to analytics and ratings and how those can begin to help shape our approach to the prospect pipeline. We've talked about portfolio management and portfolio assignment. And now we want to focus on how we move those people. So once we've identified those high capacity prospects, both based on their affinity and based on their capacity, increasingly there's a need to move them through the pipeline. We've seen this more and more at Campbell, that we're spending a lot more time talking about the importance of qualification and doing it correctly, because far too often prospects that have been identified as having capacity and who look like they have affinity are not being confirmed by frontline professionals, or we're assuming that they are qualified just because they've given in the past. So just as an aside, I wanted to share with you some questions that we often think about when we focus on qualification. I'm not going to go through these in depth because we're going to be sharing, have already shared, and will be sharing today's slides. But I think it's really important that we ask ourselves whether or not we are being very deliberate in our efforts to qualify. So are we being deliberate about confirming capacity? Are we finding out about linkages and who these people are and who they know? Are we learning preliminary information about what they're interested in and how that might map back to our priorities, to institutional priorities? And I think perhaps most importantly in that fourth box, did the prospect demonstrate an inclination to support us at a major gift level in the future, in the near future with proper cultivation? I think far too often we can get a little bit distracted by somebody's capacity and can be a bit blind to this last question, which is just because they have capacity, did we find out specific information about their willingness to engage with us at a major gift level now or in the near future? So once you've done all that, we've focused on portfolio assignment management. We're now focused on moving folks through the pipeline. It's really, really important that we talk about the reports and the monitoring that's going to be needed to make sure that all of this works. So again, this is where that science is supporting the art of relationship management. We've sort of brought it full circle here in the middle of the pyramid. And those support through team meetings or those ongoing relationship management meetings and ongoing opportunities to monitor the pipeline are really, really important, and will underscore the relationship management system that we have in place. So I want to talk about, there are a variety of different kinds of reports that can support your relationship management efforts. And in fact, I think we've done webinars on them in the past that we can point them to you. But I think that the most important thing to note is that, there are reports that are critical at the individual level, the team level, the department level, and the program level. And you can use all of that information rolled up to get a better sense of the pipeline and how it's mapping to your ultimate goals. So here we're seeing a sample of a gift table, and this could be a campaign gift table, this could be an annual gift table, but we're looking at gifts by level, the prospects needed to support gifts needed, and really, how many prospects we've identified. And once we've identified them, we are hopefully moving them through the pipeline. So where are the gaps? How many additional prospects do we need and where will they come from? And I think all of this together really underscores the importance of active management. So with that, we're going to turn our attention to the lower end of the pyramid. And again, here we're sort of more focused on the science of philanthropy, and this is where the data can be really, really, really helpful. We're talking about the power of numbers here, and really this is where your social media efforts, your direct mail efforts, your online communications can be so powerful and so critical to our philanthropic endeavors. And we can use those scores that we talked about earlier, those capacity scores, those engagement scores, those affinity scores, to help us think through segmentation. So what do we know about somebody and their level of engagement, along with other attributes? So if we know, if we're looking at a university and we know somebody seems more engaged or less engaged, and we know a little bit about their program or when they graduated, all of that together can help us produce targeted communication. So I think what's really important in this section of the pyramid is that we're focusing on leveraging communications and events that you may already have in the queue. But how can we target certain groups and sort of tweak the messages associated with those communications and events to make people feel like they're being cultivated in a more individual way, to make them feel like they're being recognized and targeted in a more individual way. Those scores, whether it's your most basic RFM or engagement score, or it's a much more sophisticated predictive modeling score, those scores can be really, really helpful in helping you sort of slice and dice the constituents in this part of the pyramid and help you think of more effective ways to communicate with them and engage. And ultimately, we're hoping that that prospects and donors begin to self-identify. So if we can target them as a group and segment them, within particular groups and hone our messages and hone our communications, then ultimately what we're hoping is that these folks can begin to self-identify and move themselves up the pyramid. Ultimately, then we have a better sense of who needs to move into identification for relationship management. So as they move up the pyramid, they move sort of from the lower end into the middle end, or middle part of the pyramid, and then they get flagged for relationship management. And from that point on, again, the goal is to manage them in one-on-one relationships and to learn more about them and what motivates them and how we can bring them in closer to the institution. Ultimately, in the lower end of the pyramid, we are really, really focused on building out that base and continuing to build out the pipeline. So I just went through all of that information really, really quickly. And so I'm just going to take a quick pause and review what we've already covered. As I mentioned, there's a lot of available data out there. We talked about analytics. We've talked about the importance of prospect research. We've talked about benchmarking and surveys, and how that information can be really, really helpful to programs as they develop both individual strategies as well as programmatic strategies. We talked about the importance of data hygiene and how you can append information to that which is already in your system. So how can you learn more about those folks and where they live, or their genders, or some of their preferences, or there's a lot of demographic information that's out there that again can be really, really helpful both to your annual giving programs or your social media campaigns, as well as to those folks who might be doing deeper dive analysis in-house. If you've got analysts in-house, that data hygiene component can be really, really helpful. We talked about why this information is so important. It's growing increasingly important in philanthropic programs because the pressure is on us. Our funding streams are being cut left and right, and there's more and more pressure on fundraising to sort of shore it up and close the gaps. And we need to be smarter about how we do that. We need to be more efficient. We need to be more effective. We need to be more transparent, and data can really be helpful in those endeavors. And we talked about how this information can support programs at all levels of the pyramid. So at the top, we're really focused on who our leaders know, and the information that our programs can provide is all about, very individual. What can we find out through a prospect research lens, and what can we find out about a prospect? What can we find out about their motivations, about their connections, about how we might be able to further inform a strategy and build a plan to bring those constituents in closer to the organization. We talked about the middle of the pyramid where art and science really combine, and those engagement scores or ratings and those capacity ratings become really, really important to help us identify those high capacity, high affinity prospects, and really hopefully get those people into one-on-one relationship management, first through qualification efforts, and then ultimately into active management, where we move them through the cycles of cultivation, solicitation, and stewardship. We talked about, those people who look like they have high capacity but may have lower affinity. What can we do to further engage them and to further qualify them and to figure out who looks like a real legitimate prospect for us and who ultimately needs to be handled in another way. We talked about lower capacity folks who really have high affinity and how we can continue to keep them engaged and keep them connected, often through the use of our annual giving vehicles, social media, and online campaigns. And then we talked about using those ratings, those capacity ratings and those affinity ratings to acknowledge that there may be some folks in our database that we just don't need to focus on as much, and that can have real benefits when it comes to resource allocation. So after all of that, we want to now focus on how do we pull all of that information together and build a plan that's going to help us succeed. So we've got some questions up here on the screen about the importance of developing a data plan. And I'm going to go through each of these questions, and then we're going to go through it again in just a moment in a slightly different way. So I think when you're first beginning to think about a data plan, you really want to acknowledge what are the goals for the program and how aggressive are they? Are we looking to simply sort of shore up our program? Are we looking to, stay the course but get a little bit better, or are we looking to do something, profound and aggressive? Because those strategies might take different levels of commitment and different levels of data. It's important to think about who you want to reach in your constituency and in your prospect pool, and what are you really trying to get them to do. So again, thinking about those different levels of the pyramid. How do we want to engage those folks, and what do we want them to do? What information do we currently have? So what information currently exists in our database, or exists sometimes in our heads and isn't yet in the database, in which case I implore you to get it in the database as quickly as possible, because we find that there's a lot of institutional knowledge that is walking around with our officers that isn't reflected in the system. So I think in this question number 3, what information do we currently have? First, look at what's in the system, but also think about who else has information that is not yet reflected in the system, and how can we get it there? And how can that information be used to support engagement, again, at all levels of the pyramid? What do we want to be doing at the top, in the middle, and at the lower levels of the pyramid? And what's reasonable given the internal resources that we have? And so when we're talking about internal resources, we're not only talking about staffing, but we're also talking about system support and program support. And I think this has gotten a lot more complex in recent years. We used to just have a database and people that managed the database. And now we've got databases and online exchanges and APIs and survey tools that come online that are linked up with our systems. And so internal resources has become perhaps a slightly more complex question to answer, but one that is still critically important when you're thinking about your data plan. So again, we're talking about not only the sophistication of and skill set of your staff, but also the sophistication of the systems that you have at your disposal. And then just thinking through, what else is going to be needed. Let's circle back, come back full circle to think about our goals and the resources that we have to be able to support them internally. What else is going to be needed to help accomplish those goals? And do we have the budget and the staff resources to accomplish that? So here you can see sort of what we do after we've kind of done a brain dump on these critical questions. Once you've got answers to these questions, I think you really want to begin to think about developing a data plan. And a plan consists of your key set of activities. You've got goals and metrics. You've got staff resources aligned within these key activities and areas. And you really want to be thinking about budget and calendar. And I think far too often, calendar in particularly is overlooked. So it becomes really important as you think about discrete projects, and we're going to go over an example of this in just a moment. But as you begin to think about discrete projects, it's really important to think about the amount of time that's going to be needed and how that is ultimately going to map back to your annual calendar or your campaign calendar. And so the more of this that you can get documented up front, the more you can get documented about what you're truly trying to accomplish and the activities that are going to allow you to get there, what staff resources that you're going to need to be able to do that. And I would say that it's not just your analyst or your database programmer. Those folks need a support system. They need people to vet ideas off of. They need people to review products and deliverables. So staff resources, we want to be thinking about it in a more comprehensive fashion. What is the budget? If we are going to focus, for those aspects of this that we're going to focus on in-house, do we have the systems that we need to support our efforts, or are we going to need to get upgrades in some ways or conversions in some ways? Those obviously have budget implications. And if we're going to go out of house, either with vendors or consultants, getting a really clear idea up front about the budget associated with that upfront will be really, really helpful. And that way you can go to leadership with a plan and say, here's what we think we can accomplish, but it's going to require this staffing, this budget, and it's going to require this amount of time. And so I wanted to just spend a moment talking through an example of converting, what happens when you convert a program objective to a data plan. So here we've got one example. In this example, we've got a major gift team whose objective is to increase their $25,000 donors, and they want to do that through qualification, and they really, really want to get people moving through the pipeline. They realize that they've been focused on a small group of higher level donors, and now they need to expand their efforts. They need to be focused on where the capacity exists. They need to be working on qualifying those people and really actually making asks at higher levels. I think this is really we see this often. This is emblematic of what we see in a lot of programs where you've got high capacity folks, but they've been lingering in cultivation, or you realize they haven't truly been qualified because you've just been asking them for lower level annual fund asks. So in this case, we've got a team who really wants to increase those sort of mid-major gifts, and they want to do that by really thoroughly qualifying their prospects and then beginning to move them through the pipeline. And they have developed a set of metrics which include tracking the number of qualifications, tracking the number of asks, not necessarily at this point the gifts received. They really want to know, are we getting the asks out there? And they want to focus on how long their prospects are staying in each of the philanthropic stages. So qualification, cultivation, solicitations, and stewardship. So this is from the major gift team. This is from the kind of the frontline aspect. And this is a program objective for them. It's one of many. But I want to talk about how this program objective can be converted to a data plan. So here, we want to focus on the key activities that are going to allow us from a data perspective to help the major gift team implement their programmatic objective. So again, they want to focus on finding those people that are higher capacity. And in order to do that, we're going to start with an electronic screening, or we're going to update a screening if we have done one recently. The idea is that we want to be focused on capacity. And our metrics are going to be the percent of our records that are now screened or have updated capacity ratings. There's likely going to be a project manager needed, or perhaps this will be done in-house by a prospect researcher, but there will definitely be some staff that is needed to be able to execute the screening effectively. There may be budget associated with it. If you're planning to just do a subset of records, it might not be significant, but if you're going to be refreshing an entire database or a larger subset of the database, there could be more budget needed, and you are likely going to be doing that with a vendor. There are a lot of vendors in this space. I know we've done webinars in the past, kind of a deeper dive into electronic screening and capacity, and so if you have questions about that, we can certainly point you to those webinars following today's session, and you can learn more about the information that is needed and is collected and the vendors who are out there to help you in this arena. Timing typically takes 1 to 2 weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less, but again, being aware of how these are all going to stack on top of each other is really, really important. So that's what we've done to help the major gift team learn more about capacity of constituents in our database. And again, capacity in a vacuum is really not enough to help us learn about our prospects. We really need more information about their affinity or about their level of engagement. And so we can do that in a few different ways. We talked about this earlier. Whether or not we're going to develop scores in-house, because we've got a team who is either going to sort of start with a more basic model or scoring, that RFM or that engagement score that we talked about a little while ago, or we've got a team that can do the more advanced predictive modeling. That's great. or we're going to contract with either a vendor or a consultant to do this out of house. Either way, our focus is to get information about our prospects and about their affinity for the organization. Again, it's really important to have a metric. This is the one we're using for this example, but you might find that something else is more useful. For here, we're going to talk about the percent of records that ultimately have a score or rating. So between the percent of records that have been screened and the percent of records that have been scored, hopefully we're getting a really, really good view of our constituent pool and those people who are high capacity, high affinity. There's either going to be a project manager that's needed for this exercise if you're going to be contracting with a consultant or with a vendor, or there's going to need to be an analyst, somebody who's doing this in-house and has the skills needed and the system support needed to be able to produce these ratings. Again, budget, probably more if it's outsourced, but in-house you might need to be thinking through whether or not you need another program, in particular for the more complex scoring and modeling. So that can vary, but it's important to think through what the budget will be for these exercises. And timing. Again, if this is an in-house exercise, it might be slightly, it might take slightly less time than if it's out of house, but I would say somewhere in the 4-week range, 4 to 6 weeks, oftentimes if you're contracting with a vendor, and perhaps slightly less if it's in-house or working with a consultant. At the end of that, you have screening, you have capacity ratings, and you have affinity indicators or affinity ratings for all or most of your database. And when you have that, you can really do a deep dive into what we call, at Campbell & Company, we call it our capacity, portfolio, and pipeline analysis. And the goal of this is to uncover those high capacity prospects, both those people who look like they have high capacity and those people who look like they are legitimate prospects now or in the near future. And we've done, I think, a series of webinars on those analyses as well, and can point you, if you're looking for more information about what a capacity, a portfolio, and a pipeline analysis look like, we can point you back to those webinars as well. They can be helpful tools. Again, you're either going to need a project manager for this activity if it's something that you are contracting with a consultant to provide, or you're going to need an analyst in-house. Again, that can influence the budget that's going to be needed, whether this is being outsourced or being taken care of in-house, and whether or not you already have the programs that you need in-house to be able to exercise this kind of analysis. However you do this, and however simple you want to make it, this type of exercise can be really, really helpful in thinking through where is your capacity, how much of it are we currently managing, and where is there untapped potential, and then how are we moving people through the pipeline right now toward active management and toward solicitation. And I think oftentimes we're really focused on the importance of visits in these analysis. So taking a good look at visits as well can be really, really helpful. Acknowledging that timing, again, can vary depending on whether or not you are working with consultants or whether or not you're doing this in-house, but typically you're talking about a few weeks to get these kinds of analysis, and you won't be able to start them until you have the work that's listed above done. So altogether, we're talking probably about 1 to 2 months to be able to effectively take a look at capacity, affinity, and be able to roll it all up and talk strategically about what you can do within a program. And then ultimately, once that's all sort of happens on the front end of the program, and we can go back to the major gift team and we can say, remembering that their goal is to increase qualification and to increase gifts of $25,000 or above. Now we can give them a lot of information about, who their best prospects are, how they might want to be engaging them, how they've been doing that in the past, and give them some real solid information about that might really transform the way they go out and approach these folks. That can be really, really important and really, really helpful to the front line. And I think underscores the partnership that has developed between the back end of our shops and the front end of our shops. I think there's a really important sort of synergy and partnership that's developed over, in particular, in the last few years as we focus on these important analytics and how they can drive behavior and inform strategy. And then ultimately, we want to be able to produce reports that monitor portfolio management, that help us with stage aging. And for those of you who don't know, stage aging is the amount of time that prospects are in certain philanthropic stages. So how long is a prospect in cultivation or in qualification? How long did it take us to move them from cultivation to solicitation? And if you can overlay that with the amount of activity during that time, you have a lot of really powerful information about your program and about what's working, and it really allows you to make informed decisions about what to tweak and what to keep. That focus on pipeline management, and then obviously solicitation. So again, remembering that this major gift team is focused on gifts of $25,000 or more. You know, we not only need to help them focus on the qualifications, on moving people to solicitations, but we want to make sure that they can capture that really useful information about solicitations in reports. And the metrics that are going to be critical are obviously developing those reports and developing them and having them in use by, hopefully, by target dates. Again, critical staff needed. You're either going to do this with a project manager or a report writer. Project manager if it's being outsourced, and report writers if it's being executed in-house. And budget, depending on whether or not this is outsourced or in-house, and if in-house, if you have the programs that you need. And then I think just allowing ample time to produce these reports. It's typically a very iterative process, and you want to make sure that you get it right. So making sure that you've budgeted enough time to be able to produce the reports, have leadership respond to them, and tweak them before kind of rolling them out is really important. So finally, we've talked about analytics, and we've talked about scores and ratings and how you can develop those scores and ratings, whether or not you're doing them in-house or whether you're doing them with the help of a vendor or a consultant. We've talked about how those scores and ratings should really be driving the way you think about the top end of the pyramid, the middle of the pyramid, and the lower end of the pyramid. We've talked about what you need to consider for developing a data plan, and what are the key questions that we need to answer to be able to execute that data plan. And we walked through an example of just one objective and how that can ultimately translate from a frontline objective to really helping us shore up and think about what we need to produce in a data plan. And so you could think about that major gift exercise, now thinking through, you know, what does the annual fund team need and what does communications need, and you can really think about extrapolating that exercise across an entire department. So once you've done that, and we worked through how to construct a data plan, and we want to finalize with implementing the data plan. And so you can see here the key steps to implementing the data plan up on the screen. We've already talked about program goals, and again, you know, we focused for our example on a major gift operation and one objective that they might be looking to accomplish, but each program across an institution is going to have similar goals, and some of them will require data inputs and some may not. So, you know, being comprehensive in the way that you collect information about those program goals is really important. And then, you know, as we just mentioned a moment ago, thinking through how you actually develop the data plan, what are those key questions that you need to answer, and how is that going to inform your plan as it relates to key activities, budget, resources, and how do you build buy-in? How do you educate your stakeholders? Once you've developed a plan, you may need to go to leadership and say, we've got a great plan, but we either need to bring in staff or we need additional resources to increase our system support or increase the support that we're going to get from a consultant or a vendor. That third step, educating stakeholders and getting buy-in, is really, really critical and often overlooked. And I think far too often is sort of the deal breaker with these plans. So I think sometimes we just assume because we've developed a plan that somebody will automatically see the value in it and automatically give us the resources that we need to be able to execute it. So thinking through who are those stakeholders that you need to educate, and how do you develop credibility and get buy-in is really important. Once you've got that and somebody has sort of blessed the plan, it's really important to take the time to assemble the right resources that you need, and then to begin to execute on those key activities. And again, having these details, having a plan with targets, with metrics is really, really important so that you can see your progress to key activities and circle back with those stakeholders, informing them of your progress along the way and where you are toward your goal. Monitoring and tracking reports, providing reports back again to those key stakeholders is really, really important. And then it probably goes without saying, but I think it's important that sometimes our key activities change as we go along. Sometimes information changes, timelines shift, and we need to be able to adjust our activities as needed or refine our metrics as needed or as appropriate. So that feedback mechanism there at the end is really important. And you can see that throughout these steps to implementing the data plan, even though this is all focused on data, you can see the importance of communication throughout this entire list of activities. And so knowing who your partners are in this process is really, really important. And I think we wanted to leave just a few moments at the end of our webinar. I know we've got a few minutes left to answer any questions that you might have.
There are some questions. Kirsten would like to know, what specific data should we be collecting in our database for engagement? Event attendance, phone calls, what else?
I would say the answer is yes. And then we're going to have much more information about this on the, as I mentioned, we're going to have a handout available for you immediately following today's webinar that can walk you through engagement in a much deeper way. I think the very simple answer to Kirsten's question is whatever data you have, you should begin to think about how you can use it to inform engagement. So if you're tracking event attendance, if you're tracking who volunteers, if you're tracking committees or board or awards, or if you begin to think through the various tabs or screens of your database and what information lives there, a lot of it can be used for engagement purposes. And certainly, some of it is historical when you think about how somebody was engaged with your organization at some point, and some of it is being kind of constantly refreshed when you think about how somebody is giving now, or how have they recently been giving, or what events are they attending, or how are they engaging with us online. So to the extent that you're tracking that information, most of it can be used to inform engagement scores. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to sort of take an inventory of what we have and think through how it can be used. I think the other thing I would just mention about engagement scores, when you are thinking about the information that you have, is thinking through who you can partner with in the process of coming up with that score. So if it's just a data person kind of at their desk by themselves thinking about events and activities, and then they present a score to leadership or to a major gift team or an annual giving team, we find more often than not that there's a lot of pushback to that score because they haven't taken something into consideration, or the other team members feel like there's additional information that should be valued or interpreted as well. So I think having folks to sound off on and to build out that engagement score together, preferably kind of cross-functionally, can be really, really important and helps you to gain buy-in as you go.
Excellent. Lee would like to know if you can further expand upon the difference between scoring in electronic screening and scoring modeling.
Sure. So when we're talking about electronic screening, we are usually talking about hard assets, wealth assets. So these are services that you would typically engage with a vendor, and some of them in this space are Target Analytics or Wealth Engine or Donor Search or iWave. So there are a number of them out there. And you would engage with a vendor, and they take the names and addresses in your file, and they run those against publicly available information. And what comes back is the people and the hard assets that they have associated with their name. So, what securities could we find? What real estate could we find? A lot of these services provide information on their philanthropic interests or philanthropic donations. So where have we been able to see that this person has made a gift? So it's all information that is publicly available and attributed directly to an individual based on their name and address. Ultimately, we use that information to inform our knowledge about somebody's capacity to make a gift. Modeling, on the other hand, is where you take information, you are looking to answer questions like, for example, who in my database looks like a major gift prospect? So in modeling, you are looking at behaviors of your current major gift prospects. So in predictive modeling, you would say, I want to find people who look like major gift prospects. You would look at those people who are currently major gift prospects, and the whole exercise around modeling is essentially developing a profile of what a major gift prospect looks like, and then scoring everybody in your database about how closely they match to your profile of a major gift prospect. So that's the difference between that electronic screening and the predictive modeling. It's what can we find specifically related to an individual based on publicly available information versus what can we guess about an individual or estimate about an individual based on the set of characteristics they have and how closely they align with others in our database.
Great. Catherine would like to know, how can you quantify affinity?
So I think affinity gets back to engagement, or affinity and engagement and inclination are sort of used interchangeably. I think affinity is, you can kind of, I don't want to say, you can begin to quantify it based on those predictive scores and ratings that we've talked about. So, if you're just starting out, you can begin to get a sense of affinity through an engagement score. If you're, much more complex in your analytics, either through a vendor or through in-house, you can do a much deeper dive in a lot of different ways to affinity. Ultimately, you can't really confirm affinity. I think that's best done by a frontline officer or by a staff member. So we can get insights into somebody's affinity based on their patterns of giving, based on their patterns of event attendance, based on the way that they volunteer or they engage with us through social media platforms. I think those are all indicators, and we can use those to develop scores. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we are confirming that with real conversations between people.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Our next webinar is going to be on international fundraising, and that will be on November 16th at noon Central Time, and you can always register at www.campbellandcompany.com. And I think that will conclude our webinar for today.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and my information is up on the screen there, so if you have any questions based on the information that we talked about today or based on the information that we're going to point you to following today's webinar, please feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.